Okay, it's another episode of Esports Mount Rushmore. And since my guest for this one is going to be Capitalist, a Dota 2 commentator, it will obviously be about Dota 2. And we had one before where it was Skim doing it, and he had some interesting picks because, I mean, one of the features that I try to emphasize for this particular series is I don't just want it to be, you know, the four consensus names that everyone would have on a list, because it kind of actually, what's funny is by having a consensus, you kind of remove all the individual reasons, which is the real reasons I want to know that the person picks the people, you know. So I already know you got there's some crossover, but there's some different names. So hit me with the first name, Capitalist. Who's the first person for your Mount Rushmore for Dota 2?
All right, so for the first name, I don't care how much people love him or hate him.
Oh, I think we know where we're going on this one. Come on.
Yeah. This one recently has got a whole lot of controversy around him, but I don't really give a shit, all right? I don't give a shit how much people like him or how much people hate him. I don't care if he's a shitty person or not. I don't care if he's part of a shitty organization. I don't care about any of that. If you're going to have a conversation about the faces of Dota and individual impact on the Dota scene, you do not have this conversation without Puppey, period. Like that's just the way it is. Puppey is the OG captain of Dota. This guy has been like there I think when you asked me to do this and I was like, what would be the criteria for being able to come up with these names? And for me, I think Dota's probably one of the better games to do a Mount Rushmore piece because it has so much history. So for me, part of it is having history, but also being able to have consistency. Like that, there are plenty of old names that we can go back to, and we can talk about like one-off times where like Vigos was a god in the Blink Dota patch, you know, back in the Dota 1 days where Blink didn't put on cooldown when you got damaged. Like that guy was a god. Like that guy was the best ganker in Dota, and in like that one very specific period of time. But you couldn't talk about him in any other point. So Puppey has the history, and he has the consistency, and he has the leadership that if you're going to talk about it, he has to be like, he's the first name when it comes to Mount Rushmore. Even if it comes down to like all the controversial stuff that's come out about him, it doesn't matter. He's got the results to be able to back it up when you talk about impact in the Dota scene within its competition.
Okay, so this is actually a perfect one to start with, just for what my own personal bias is in esports, because I always say that one thing I love about esports games is because they're played inside a computer. I mean, actually, in life in general, it's the same, but even better in a computer, because inside of a computer, okay, there is actually no human impact beyond like what players do. So there's no like politics or favoritism or popularity. So what's great is inside a computer game, you could be the biggest asshole ever. You could actually be a serial killer, but as long as you are wicked at the video game, you know, the hits still register, you still get the same items, you still dominate the game. Meanwhile, you could be the loveliest guy in the world, you know, and you could be a sweetheart, and you could be rescuing puppies. But if you are a trash bag at that video game, you will be exposed as being utterly terrible. Now, whether people choose to acknowledge that doesn't matter. Inside that computer, it is a harsh reality, which in some ways, being a fucked up person, I wish real life was like. But in real life, if you are a nice guy, people like you, and if you know, unfortunately, like it's actually outside of the matrix that's bothering Thorin. So in this context, though, I want to actually tie it into Puppey as a leader, because obviously with the recent things that came out about maybe he was I guess the simplest way to put it would be maybe he was a bit unreasonable in how he leveraged personal relationships with some of his players, and maybe he's not a very respectful teammate at times. As much as people might say, like, oh, that just, you know, puts everything else he did. Who cares about what he did inside the game? You know, what a terrible person. I actually have a real question, which is if you now know some of that stuff that maybe you didn't know before, or maybe it was just kind of like kept under the lid, does that make you think anything different about how he was a captain? Because obviously there is a type of being a captain where people are very authoritarian, you know, where people are very strict.
Yes.
And this doesn't necessarily have to be a bad thing, you know. Sometimes it can just be that kind of the general approach, you know, I mean, like as in the military term, the general approach to being a leader. What does it make you think about his in-game leadership in that sense?
I mean, I had heard things about this prior to some of the controversy coming out, but I did know that Puppey was like a very strong-willed captain, and he was somebody who would make people be on the same page with him, right? And obviously it's come out that he is like, he can have quite the temper and all that sort of thing, but the same kind of characteristics that give him that temper and makes him do some of the things that people maybe don't like, is also the same kind of characteristics that do make up a very strong captain, right? He ensures that the team is on the same page, that they're following his approach to the game. And that's something that we have a long history of Dota to be able to look back on, right? That there is so much history, decade plus of history to be able to fall back on. And if you look at the players and the teams who have succeeded not just in one patch, but in multiple patches, it has been about being able to adapt strategy-wise, to be able to not just fall into kind of this one-hit wonder sort of idea, but being able to adapt to the changes that happen within the meta, but also being able to ensure that the team is on the same page. Because especially now, as the patch becomes more and more open, right, we have arguably the best patch that Dota has ever had, and there are so many different strategies and so many different heroes that are viable within the competitive realm, that you need to be able to, everyone has to be on the same page, right? And I think that's so important, right? Everybody has to follow one idea. Everyone has to trust each other. And if they don't, trust each other, then they better damn well fall in line anyway. And I think that's something that Puppy ensured for the longest time. It was why he was able to have, I mean, you look at this guy, like nobody has better captain results than Puppy. This guy's won TI, and whether or not you want to argue about the importance of the later TIs, and they did get a lot more competitive, and yes, the first TI was arguably the least competitive and the easiest to win. He still won that TI. He got second at TI2, TI3, and yet the guy, even after we had this huge swing and highly competitive environment where all the regions were playing against each other and in these international competitions, and everyone became so much better because of that, all the regions benefited, he was still one of the best captains out there. You talk about throughout the whole entire history of Dota, you want to say top 3 captains, Puppy has always been in that list, and that goes to show this guy, he has what it takes to make results. He's had the best TI results of any captain just through pure placement. He's the first player to be able to win 2 Valve events. He is also the player that the captain player / captain, S4 was obviously taking part of that role, but he was part of the arguably one of the most consistently dominant teams throughout the history of Dota, which was Secret and their patch leading up to TI5. Now, obviously, they did not succeed in TI5. They dropped out early, but leading up into TI5, they were extremely dominant, and everybody was looking towards Team Secret and looking on how they played and changing their play style in order to try and keep up with Secret. And Secret had tried to constantly stay one step ahead throughout the whole entire year. And yeah, they fell at the end, but he came back and won Shanghai, right? And so that says Puppy has, no matter what negative aspects of his character there are out there, he very clearly has what it takes to be able to succeed within a team environment and within being able to understand the strategy and nuances when it comes to Dota.
So one of the things that is always associated with Puppy as a player and an in-game leader is obviously drafting. And so bearing in mind, in Dota 2, he has basically played from the beginning. How would you describe his impact in terms of drafting? Were there periods when it was better or more noticeable that he had an edge in this way, or certain teams that fit it better?
I think that's if you look back to perhaps TI2 was a very surprising run. TI3, that was an alliance dominant meta, and yet I think that's probably one of the better examples, is that TI3 Alliance was a team that understood. They broke the patch down. They just understood really, really well how to be able to play that game at that time, and they just destroyed everyone. And Na'Vi was the only team who could put up a fight, and there was something about being able to understand perhaps the in-depth, the parts of Alliance that they were able to put forward, right? The split pushing strategy and all those sorts of things. Na'Vi were able to break that a little bit. And even if they didn't come out and win TI and we would have this epic final and all that sort of thing, the fact that they came close to being able to do so says so much, because no other team was able to adjust to what Na'Vi was doing, or excuse me, what Alliance was doing at that time. The only team who was able to do so successfully was Na'Vi, was Puppy, being able to make the differences when it came to draft and in-game play. I think drafting-wise, Puppy has arguably been, just like as a captain, been in that top 3 area for quite some time. The early first 3 years of Dota 2, definitely up there as 1 or 2 constantly. And then later on, he's dropped off a bit, but that's only because the competition has become thicker and thicker. But his drafting has always remained diverse, right? He's never had to fall back on picking 4-position junglers every single game. He's adapted to, like, going way back in the day, he adapted to tri-lanes when tri-lanes first became a thing. It was way back in like 2008 or something. The guy was adjusted to what went from 2-1-2, right? Having dual lanes on the side and having one mid. And then all of a sudden, in the Chinese scene, and I think it was like WCA or something like that, tri-lanes started becoming a thing. And he adjusted to tri-lanes, and then we had these other advances they came in as we went into Dota 2. That guy has always been able to adjust his draft to what has been able to not just fit the meta, but also be able to counter what is strongest at the time, which is where TI3 comes into play.
Okay, because one of the things that's interesting is, because I'm not a Dota 2 expert myself, I have to say the drafting's one of the areas where I just have to kind of trust the experts who are telling me on the stream, whether someone did a good job or not there. I can't really know in depth whether or not he did some really clever pick. So one of the areas I always wondered about was in the post-Na'Vi period, when he's in this secret team, because the one you're referencing here, sure, basically came in as the favorite to win TI. I mean, TI5, they came in, they'd won the 4 tournaments in a row. But if you think about even when they were winning, how people kind of broke that team down, a lot of people did just say, well, I mean, it's an all-star team, You've got people like S4, Arteezy. So, I mean, these guys just play basically their own picks, and they're going to win off that, So when they lost, I didn't see actually that many people critique Puppy in this sense. They weren't like, oh, you drafted poorly or you did a bad job. It was mainly just like, right, well, they won it because they had star players. They lost, right? I guess some of the players didn't play so well. What do you think he was like in the secret era? Because obviously these are players who had pretty defined personalities, right?
Yeah, I think there is a bit of a... I think people want to be able to give a free pass to Puppy. I think drafting-wise, he was still on top of it. I think if you watch back to ESL1 Frankfurt 2015 that went into TI5, they won that, and I believe they did win it off of the draft. I think that going into I think another example of Puppy's drafting is that even if you want to excuse the whole entire secret era and say that he had a bunch of star players to be able to work off, how could you not be successful in some ways? Like, he could pick whatever, and individually his teammates would be able to shine on whatever he picked, and therefore they'd be able to win the games just based off of individual skill. I think if you look past that and you look towards the era of Shanghai, like, that would be my response, right? Look at Frankfurt, look at Shanghai, the first 2 majors. You see the time where Puppy was once again drafting for them, and he did outdraft. You look at the Shanghai winners, I think it was the upper bracket final they had versus Liquid. I believe that was the upper bracket, and I absolutely believe that Secret outdrafted when it came to that. They picked up they adjusted their picks a little bit. They had this special. He had this like kind of back pocket, right? Weehaw as their mid, who since ended up getting kicked out of Team Secret after the Shanghai major, and there was a whole entire controversy about that. He was individually playing incredibly well at Shanghai major, and some of these hero picks were able to win them the game, but it was the way he drafted to allow them to pick up those hero picks that ended up winning the draft for them. So when they were able to counter Fada's Invoker with Weeha's Wind Ranger and have him move around the map and be this like really strong ganking force when the Invoker was supposed to just be able to sit in that mid area, like, that part of it is the drafting that opens that up. It's not just Weeha being able to play that. It's the way that they were able to limit the rather, because Liquid was rather dependent on being able to run this aggressive carry in Matumba Man and be able to move him around the map. So once they were able to get their mid online as well and be able to combat that aggression, that then they were able to actually take over Liquid in just this really quick 2-0 stomp in that upper bracket. So I think that in many ways the drafting is what allowed them to be able to win, even when they didn't have the most individually skilled players in the world.
Whenever someone has a reputation for being like a very intelligent player or cerebral player or this captain style role, you'll notice in most games it also comes with the other additional stereotype, which is that usually as individual players, they're not that great. And in fact, maybe there's someone who doesn't, as a result, doesn't put much of their, essentially their brain power to the individual side. And then usually they just try and like plug in the gaps, you know, and then they try to be the guy who's controlling the whole thing, you know. What do you think Poppy over his Dota 2 career has been like as an individual player? Like if we ignored the captaincy for a second, which obviously you can't entirely do because some of the things you're doing play into your overall goal. But as an individual player, like how would you rank him and kind of the positions he's played?
I would say for the criteria that I did for this, I don't think that any of the players that I'm going to choose, barring one, was at any point in time the best player in their individual role. You can maybe make an argue for Puppy's jungling play. He's always been known as being an excellent Chen and Enchantress and being able to use the roaming, the strategy that comes into roaming, I think fit Puppy particularly well from an individual player aspect. Right, it was more of a strategic rather than a mechanical play for him. So I think in parts that's where he really he shined the most, when he was to pick up those roamers. So even after the jungling era, when we started getting away from Chen and Enchantress, which is what Puppy's like most well known for, we started getting into this ganking era in more recently in like the Frankfurt and Shanghai eras. We started getting these 4 positions that would roam around a lot rather than utilizing the jungle. And Puppy still was able to make those adjustments. He would pick up like Doom, and he even adjusted to a newer hero in Earthspear. He was able to adjust to those heroes and still be mechanically strong enough to have a average impact as a 4 position. But I would say he was never the best player at his position. And most of these people that we're going to be talking about are not. And that's because Dota is not necessarily a game that is focused more on mechanics. I'd say that maybe 75% of it is about strategy. And that goes to show, like, especially when games can be won and lost just purely off of draft, it goes to show what a chess match that Dota really is. Individual plays, mechanically skilled players do matter, but they can come and go, honestly. Within Dota, there are so many people who can play mechanically, like at a mechanically 1% position, and you could just interchange like pub players for some of these other actual pro players. And from a mechanical perspective, you'd be able to see very little difference. But the element that really separates the true professionals from the amateurs is the understanding of strategy. And Puppy is very clearly someone who understands strategy through and through.
So one of the interesting things about captains is when you look at the patterns of their careers, like which star players they had in which era. Obviously, Poppy's a very interesting one because he's had some radically different star players. You know, I mean, he's had like Havost and Dendy, and then he's had S4 and Arteezy, and then he's had Eternal Envy and Weehart. So he's had a very diverse kind of group of people here. Whereas, like, think of like a classic other captain like PPD, for example. He's had a fairly limited set of, it's like the same sort of people, and he's just using them in different roles, perhaps. But otherwise, like he's kind of like picking players that are going to fit his system. What do you think Poppy's been like in this respect? Like, do all teams have like a Poppy style? What do you think does he get the most out of his stars? Like, how would you kind of rate him on these scales?
I would say that in some ways, Poppy is going to be one of those players who picks up somebody and they do have to mold to his ideas about Dota. That being said, all of his ideas about Dota do change over time based on the meta. So I think that, yes, you can say that all of Puppy's teams do have the Puppy style, but the interesting thing is that Puppy's been a player around long enough that you can't say like, oh, they're still picking up the junglers, you know, in 2015. Like that doesn't happen. So within the certain metas, I would say absolutely Puppy does adjust his team. He's not the one who adjusts for his team, you know, like in a certain respect, you'll still pick your mid, what he thinks is best in that 1v1 matchup if you need it. But I think that Puppy absolutely is the person who makes the players adjust to him. And I think that's why you saw certain things like, for example, the Shanghai Major, where despite winning, they ended up losing players. It was simply because of the fact that that I believe that Puppy felt like he was going to be able to get players who would be able to fit into his mold better, right? And then that kind of says a lot about his personality, right? I think that goes to show why he has had so much success is because he is the puppet master who has the full plan in his head, and you better get online with that. And that created so much success that you can't really fault him, I guess, in some ways for trying to make everybody follow his plan.
Okay. And what about in terms of using stars? I mean, for example, okay, if you look at a team like OG, like as much as you want to credit a lot of the other people, and there obviously were some very good players in that team, a lot of that is like, Miracles just going ham in half the games, So you can see like the stars have massive impact. Whereas, for example, if I look at some of like PPD's Evil Geniuses teams, it wasn't always just a superstar player carrying the team. You could see it was like a unit in some sense. How do you think? Can you see kind of a philosophy as to how Puppy uses his stars?
I could say that let's see. I think Puppy has always had a star to be able to work with, but I don't believe that he tries to build his team around that star. Going so far as like OG, where they very much crafted their team around Miracle and being able to give Miracle the space. Not necessarily that Miracle is the person who makes that team work, but it was just the ideas that they came up with. That Miracle was a very mechanically strong player, so they would be able to adjust perhaps some of their more mechanically weaker players, or even saying that the strategical element of their teams were able to adjust to make Miracle shine the most. Sure. I don't think Puppy has ever done that so far. Is like, I can't think of a single team where he was like really making sure that like on Secret that S4 shined, or on Navi that he was really trying to make sure that Dendi was going out of control. But he always had a star player to be able to utilize as a tool, I guess, to be able to make the strategy work even further. So I don't think he ever tries to fit the piece around, the queen or anything like that. I think that he is more utilizing that piece to progress his own thoughts when it comes to how to end the game, or how to at least secure a strong advantage. So if you have a Dendi, for example, and you're able to give him a strong 1v1 matchup, which happened frequently within Navi, then fantastic, you're able to win your mid. But how are you going to utilize that mid position, who now has a net worth lead, to be able to then gain more ground from there? And that would come through like the jungling aspect would come in, right, where you were able to take ground via these sustained pushes that were offered by being able to have a hero like Chen with a mech and with all these neutral creeps. So I don't think he necessarily fits his strategy based around one star player. I think more likely he uses that star player like a tool.
Okay. Right. Who's our second name going to be then? We started strong. We started with the edgy pick to start out with. So who's our second going to be?
Okay, then I guess if I go for the edgy pick,
okay.
Edgy, I guess in some ways. I mean, all of these are going to be fairly obvious. So
sure.
I'll go with probably the most obvious of all. First of all, Thorin. I'm American. All right.
Okay, here we go. Right, he's winning them all back. He's getting all the fans back.
So I can't. There's no way I can have a piece called Mount Rushmore that doesn't feature Fear.
Okay.
Fear is the George Washington of NA Dota. This guy goes all the way back. Right. He goes all the way back to the in-house leagues of Dota 1. And the reason that I keep harping on the history of some of these players is Dota is a game that has a very deep history to it, but it is not a game that has remained the same the whole entire through. We have had very dramatic shifts in the meta and how the game is played throughout this time. So the reason it's important to be able to have a history is to show that you are not just a good enough player in one period of time, but you were a good enough player to be able to adapt to all the changing rules, the unofficial rules of what Dota was within the competitive scene. And Fear absolutely proved that he is arguably the most versatile player at a professional level that there has ever been, right? Fear plays at a top level whatever you want him to play. And part of it is the fact that he has this history to be able to fall back on. The dude's been playing Dota for 15 years or something like that. This guy was playing back in in-house leagues back when like professional Dota wasn't a thing. So he has this history to be able to fall back on, and he can play every single one of those heroes at like that. If you look at a hero and playing it like from a mechanical perspective and a strategical perspective, like both of those kind of like bars, right? And you say that, I can play this hero from a mechanical perspective at 95%. But from a strategical element, how does it fit into a lineup, and what does it really do for you objectively? Some player maybe only understands 75% of it. For Fear, it's 95-95. You know, if you look at a professional level, this guy always maximizes what his hero is supposed to accomplish, both mechanically as well as strategically. And that's why he was able to make such a big impact as a captain as well as a support player.
Okay, so this is
a carry, as a carry.
Sure,
as well as
a carry, yeah, sure.
Yeah.
So the interesting thing was when Skim put Fear into his Mount Rushmore as well, he also had the implication that in some sense Fear wasn't the captain of most of the successful teams, because obviously he had PPD in the latter era, etc., who very much is the captain, but that he in some way he did have some kind of a captaincy in terms of maybe not like picking the draft, but like, you know, the other elements of being a captain, being a leader, bringing people together, like keeping people on side, being the enforcer sometimes for what the guy who's the drafter does. So what would you say about this element? Because obviously this is part of the mystique, right? He is like Captain America. People think this is the guy you just, if he says something, it must be right.
Yeah, I mean, I think his leadership is certainly a big part of why he is on my Mount Rushmore list. Just because, like, there were problems with him being the captain of EG way back, right? Like, I don't think that was a role that Fear necessarily felt very comfortable with. I don't think he really enjoyed being a captain or being looked to try and make any sort of decisions. I think that he really found his place when he found PPD, who's someone who is willing to take the burden of captaining and drafting and allowed Fear to kind of shine as a co-captain position, right? The veteran who is able to make the call when the pressure is really on of what to do in game. And that's the thing, is that Dota is a game that we have captains, and we look towards these people as like the gods of strategy, and they're the ones moving the chess pieces around. And sometimes I think we lose a little bit of the understanding of how the teams operate together, right? Just because one person, like we talk about Puppy and like being the puppet master and that sort of thing, just because one person is moving the pieces around when it comes to the draft and the idea of what the strategy is going to be does not necessarily mean that they are the person who is controlling what is happening inside of the game. When all of a sudden the game plan shifts, when what you thought was going to happen turns out to be totally bunk, and you have to come up with a new plan. And that's something that Fear on his carry role, right, when he was playing the carry, would be able to do for you. Because oftentimes when you're going towards these games and you're going 40, 45, 55 minutes plus, the game plan has changed most likely, right? If you're no way are you sitting there from a drafting position and going, yes, at 1 hour and 10 minutes in, we're going to go for this smoke gank wraparound, and they're going to be able to contest Roshan and end the game, right? That's not your idea behind the draft. You're trying to set yourself a clear advantage by 20, 30, 35 minutes most. And you're looking to be able to close out the game by a certain point in time. And that is where the drafting element of the strategy really ends. What happens after that is just what happens when you have really close games, when you have situations that you didn't expect, when you didn't anticipate that an enemy's strategy and the way they pick their heroes was actually going to be able to go later game than you expected. Like there are things that just change within, like, strategical elements that change within Dota that you can't anticipate. And that, I think, is where Fear probably really shined. It's because he is operating on the carry role. He was having that really high net worth. He could be a very impactful player when it was needed. And you need the rest of your players to be able to rally around what that player is thinking, right? You can't just have your supports thinking, this is how Dota is going to be played, and then leave their carry, who has a different idea, out in the sun. Like, you can't have that. You need to be able to operate around your carry player at a certain point in time, right? That's why most recently we had the change up on Liquid. Everybody wanted to know, why is Kuroki, why would he traditionally played support for so long, why was he playing carry for Liquid when they drafted certain lineups, whenever they got the Gerard Ranger? And the answer was because that lineup is based around what the carry does. So therefore, the carry needs to be an in-game leader, and he needs to be able to make these clutch decision calls on what to do. And I think that's what Fear really gave you, is that while PPD would set the stage for the strategy and be able to gain the advantage for them, what happened in-game, and especially what happened late-game when Fear was playing carry, comes down to what Fear is reading about the game, right? He's got all that veteran experience, more experience than all of these pro players, some of them combined, right? He's got more experiences than some of these newer pro players combined. So he's able to, off of all that experience, be able to say, yeah, I've been there. I've been there in that 80-minute plus match where we've been mega'd and we have to go down mid. I know how to be able to, in-game tactically, be able to find us the opening for a win.
Sure. So one of the interesting things about his time as a carry, and obviously they did win the international when he was the carry. So taking that with a grain of salt, like the interesting thing was, I think if you did the unfair thing, right, and you took all the carries out of their teams and you didn't consider who they play with and how they play around the spit, and you just looked at them in terms of like who's the most skilled carry, I don't think anyone would have picked Fear. But the interesting thing when you look at this TI championship run where he was the carry was, obviously, this is why people always throw the term versatility around, because, I mean, he's someone who could play a lot of different heroes. And if you're already someone like PPD who's trying to do very interesting drafts and get certain advantages, having your carry not have to, be put onto those couple of heroes that they always just dominate the whole game on, that style of like the old school Chinese carry, it's pretty valuable, right?
Oh, yeah. I mean, we can see now what the drop-off is, right? We've seen players, we've seen carries. In fact, we've seen mid players who just drop off dramatically once their hero pool that was attached to a certain kind of meta fades away. If you look back to what was one player? Like, okay, I've got another NA Dota guy, Korok. Korok was well known for his Morphling carry play. And that hero fell off real dramatically after the TI that Korok played on and was so dominant. He fell off real quickly in part because there were a lot of things attached to it, but in part because his hero pool was changed. Aggressive. Look at him. Like he was the most dominant carry. Easily, he was the best carry at that tournament. And the way that he was playing, he did so much for CDEC and his gyrocopter.
Well, I mean, people might think it's unfair, okay, but just to give a contrast here, okay, so obviously Arteezy at one point in time might have been the best pro in the world, fantastic carry player, but he is someone in general who seems to have certain heroes he wants to play in general, and as a result, he's literally changed position a few times if he thought that meant he could keep playing some of those heroes, right?
Yeah, and that's something that he's had to learn to start adjusting to, right? Like, now we have Arteezy all of a sudden playing, like, safe lane Venomancer. Like that is not like Arteezy is known to be a rather greedy player, and that he wants to be able to have a larger percentage of the net worth when it comes to the overall game. And he was paired up with Samael on a certain iteration of Evil Geniuses, and that very clearly did not fit because you had a 1 and 2 position who were both more farming oriented. It did not create space for the other. Fear was somebody who always would be able to create space as a carry position. If it was necessary, that guy would always be able to create space for another player. And that's something that, like, I think it's really important to be able to have that versatility. Yes, he was not the technically best, I think, at any point in time in his career, and in that one position, except maybe if you want to say TI5 Evil Geniuses, solely because of the fact that he did have the versatility and they were able to adjust their strategy in some ways to be able to deal with CDEC. But aggressive from a mechanical perspective, he was so good. Like him being able to create and do so much with that gyrocopter and the way they played ultra aggressive, and they made these rotations where aggressive would leave his lane super early and they would smoke up and they would invade the enemy safe lane. It would go and they would fight and they would use this fighting hero to be able to gain themselves more and more an advantage and beat down the enemy team. That was something you could only do in that period of time. And now we see nobody looks at aggressive as the best carry in the world. Nobody looks at aggressive even close to being the best carry in China right now. And that is a very dramatic shift, whereas Fear has always been regarded, maybe he wasn't ever first. Maybe he was never the best carry in the world, or maybe he wasn't even the best support or anything like that. But he was always at least in the top 10, at the bare minimum. At any point in time in his career, he was probably top 10. And I think that says so much more when Dota is a strategy-based game and not so much focused on the mechanics. The mechanics can win you clutch scenarios, but they will not win you series after series after series, right? And so him being able to have the versatility as a player amplifies what you're able to do from a captain in a drafting position and how you're able to make that strategy work.
Okay, so to highlight this versatility and the fact that not only like in terms of hero pool, but obviously moving around different positions, can you pick out a couple of what you would consider classics? Like, this is a great example of where he can play this hero at this position at this time, and that was like a benefit, a boon for his team.
Sure, I can go ahead and look at if you want to talk about. I'll go ahead and counter my own point in that, I talk about the idea of him being able to create space for others. We'll talk about one of his probably best heroes out there, which is Sven, right? Fear is known for the Fear Sven is something that has been like he even has it attached to him in his name when it came to free to play. The sets that came out, he had a Sven set because that's what he was known for at that period in time. Like he was more of a hard farmer. But then later on, we got to see certain things like all of a sudden you would have like a safe lane Slardar that would come into play for Fear, and it would just be able to utilize that hero to be able to pick up a Blink Dagger and get aggressive and create space and be able to open the map up more for your mid position rather than being the one who's taking more safe lane farm and trying to make more of a 30+ minute impact into the game. He had heroes like Syllabear, right? Like that's not necessarily something that like safe lane like one positions are necessarily known for. That since TI3 has been viewed as an off lane position. But Fear plays a really good Syllabear. I'm not sure how many people realize that, but he does. That sort of versatility, right? Those are three very distinct different styles, right? One is an ultra aggressive in the Slardar. One is an ultra aggressive Blink Dagger first hero that is able to create space for others. The other is a hard farming hero that hits a very serious impact in the game at probably 25 minutes when he's used his cleave to be able to gain a significant net worth over the enemy carry, and then he goes from there and just kind of bullies the enemy team because he has this net worth lead. And then you've got Syllabear, who's very much more of a lone operator who is able to be able to play more of a sacrificial role when it came to sitting back and not getting every CS in the lane when it matters, right? I think some carries, you look at some carries and they can't actually operate without, when they're contested, when they are put to the test when it comes to the laning phase and there's some sort of aggressive tri-lane that is run at them, and that carry is not able to hit his normal item timings, they will fall apart. Fear, however, will not fall apart. That guy will always be able to know when he needs to be able to play it safe and sit back and sit inside the jungle. When he plays a lone druid and all of a sudden he has to take one in every like 2 out of every 4 CS that comes in off of his bear and has to play super passive, like that guy can do that as well. I think those are 3 very distinct play styles in those 3 carries that kind of highlight what exactly Fear can do as a carry. And you can and that's the thing, like I picked 3 almost at random. I picked the Sven just because, that's the Fear Sven. But I could have probably picked so many other carries. I probably could have picked up some bushing here. I could have gone Draw Ranger or something like that. And people would have been like, I remember a dope ass Fear Draw Ranger game, And that would have been the thing, right? Because that guy has proven himself on so many heroes that you can just kind of reach into the pool of carries and just pick one out and say, here's an example.
Okay, who's the third name going to be?
So the third name, so I didn't actually, shame on me, but I didn't actually listen to the skims, but I did at least see his names after I decided my name. So unfortunately, Thorin, you're going to have to deal with a repeat name again. Okay. Honestly, you can't really look at the Chinese scene and say any other name than Zhao Wei. This guy has, again, I don't want to always look towards captains and say, I'm only going to pick 4 captains and say these are the guys that must be the faces of Dota. Sure. But you can't, because Dota is such a strategy focused game, you cannot ever discount how important the captain role is within Dota. And if they can also be a strong player or a versatile player when it comes to, say, for example, Fear, who's known to be able to play many, many different heroes and many different roles and shine, you can't discount being a strong captain and a strong player. And I think Zhao Wei, again, is probably going to say not the best player at any point in time when it comes to his career, but he was able to play multiple roles. He was able to be the off lane. He played the mid. He could be the support. all while captaining and leading his team to victory.
Okay, so as you mentioned, yeah, he was someone who was mentioned in Skims as well, because, I mean, actually, I think as we do more of these, the ones that I keep open like this where people can pick any position, any region, I think Zhao 8 and Poppy and Fear, two of those three are probably going to be a lot of people's picks, okay, if I don't make them narrow the criteria. So one of the interesting things about Zhao 8 is I actually remember one of the periods where I actually got into watching Dota 2 is because of League of Legends, right? And what happened was a player who used to be a Dota 1 player who was a League of Legends pro, I was asking him at the time why in Chinese League of Legends, like AD carry was the most important position. They used to always have the star player there, and almost every team would play around having that be like the guy who carried the whole game, basically. And he said, oh, well, actually, if you come from Dota, that's the way like Chinese Dota invented how to play the game. They would just literally do what in Dota you call, 4 protect 1. Like you would just have the one carry that you just fuel up, and then the idea is at some point in the game, if you haven't fucked up, he can just then win the whole game for you. Now, when I heard this, I started watching Chinese Dota, and at the time I started watching was, like 2013. So at the time, like, yeah, Chinese Dota was very good at the time, but I already quickly noticed that, like, Dota had moved on a lot from this period of time. It wasn't just like you just have the one cat. And now you saw these quite diverse teams, and you saw the era when, one metagame style comes up, but then that's countered by another one, and then another one comes up and counters that, and you basically have to either have the best at your metagame style, or you have to be the guy on the cutting edge. It's like you have to be one of the two. What was Zhao 8's impact on the metagame of Dota 2 like?
I don't think Zhao 8 necessarily ever led the meta. As far as my view on Zhao 8, it comes to that guy was always able to make his team adapt to what the meta is at the time, right? Like I'm glad you brought up the old days of what Chinese Dota was like, because if I wanted to look at any other Chinese name, if I look at, say, like ZSMJ, or if I look at Burning, like I'd have to talk to you, like ZSMJ, I'd have to talk about, like, we would be ending the discussion. We would start really strong and talk about the Dota 1 days and how good he was and going into Dota 2 and his impact there. And then we would be ending the discussion on White Fries Gaming, I think is his team name. If I talked about Burning, right, that guy being the god carry, like one of the people who he was why there was a 4 protect 1 strategy, and why teams were able to be so good at it, because he was such a strong carry and he was such a good efficient farmer. If I talk about him, then I'd also have to end the discussion on the multiple really disappointing or even just bad performances that he's had on the carry role over the last year or two. So if I look at any of those older names, we'd have to say, yeah, but they dropped off at this point in time. Zhao 8 and what he represents as the captain, right, and always being able to adapt to what the meta comes, is still relevant today, more so than ever. Right, that guy just won the Chinese qualifier with a team that doesn't really have a whole lot of star power to it. You talk about captains, you talk about, like, being able to utilize your stars, or like how much those individual players were able to make those picks be so much better than they actually were. Like there are some talks about that, right, within the Dota scene. You talk about like how much like a team outdrafted someone else, and how much the individual play of the players made the draft work rather than the draft actually working for them, right? They made the draft work. And I think Zhao 8 very clearly has proven that when it comes to the strategical elements, he does not require star power. Like he's on a team he's on a team right now with, like, he's got some new guy called like Monet, right? And LGD Forever Young, or whatever their name is, like they are not the be all end all of like Chinese star power by any means. That guy doesn't even have maybe on his team. But that's exactly the point, right? This guy was able to make this lineup work, and he got first in that Chinese qualifier, whereas LGD, the team that got top of their group and all that sort of thing, couldn't even secure a qualifying spot. They couldn't even get first or second. They had maybe on their team one of the best Chinese, like in my opinion, he's like one of the best Chinese mids out there. I think that guy, super talented. But Zhao 8, he doesn't need maybe anymore. Like he can make almost any team work, I think, because of the understanding of strategy. And I don't know exactly what he's like when it comes to team, like when it comes to the team dynamics, right? And how to make, people work together. We talk about Puppy, and I was able to, like, at least I know Puppy, right? I've talked to him a number of times. I've talked to a number of players who have played with Puppy and what their thoughts are on him. But Zhao Wei is a player that I can't really get that close to, so we won't be able to talk about like how important like those outside things, right? Like morale and all those other things. But Zhao Wei has always remained relevant, at least when it comes to strategy. Maybe he wasn't always leading the meta, but he was at least very quickly picking up what other teams were doing and adapting to it.
So obviously, if you talk about Zhao Wei, I mean, if someone's won an international, you should probably talk about when they won the international. So sure. Zhao Wei won the international for with Newbie, obviously, and would it be naive to say that if you win an international and everyone says the most boring fucking final ever, this sucks, Dota is dead, China's killed Dota, that tells me if you're the captain, you did a fucking bang up job. Like, you had the meta figured out and you knew what to do. This must have been a masterpiece, right?
Well, see, here's the thing. It's like you had other teams like Vici Gaming who were doing this incredibly good like death ball strategy, right? I actually think that in some ways Vici Gaming was better and then Newbie at being able to use this one strategy of being the death ball pushers in. Like, I think they were in some ways a little bit better at it. But Newbie, the reason Newbie were able to beat Vici Gaming in 2 series was the fact that they understood, like Zhao Wei understood how to be able to stop that strategy. It's not just about like leading the meta and being able to say like, oh, these heroes are really strong, right? So let's go ahead and cobble this strategy together that really exploits, the certain overpowered elements that are in the game or certain heroes that are overpowered at this point in time. Sometimes it's about being able to say, yeah, they have that. They have the sustained death push that is never going to die, and they're going to go high ground by 20 minutes, but we know how to hold against them. And that's what Newbie really did, right? They understood not just how to do the death ball, they understood how to counter the death ball. And that's where they were able to beat Vici Gaming 2 times in a row, right? They won the first series. I don't remember if it was 2-1 or 2-0. It's been a long time, but they won that final 3-1, right? A very dominant victory. People are like complaining about it. It's just like, oh, it's like it was such a boring final and that sort of thing. But that tournament, from a pure strategy perspective, was very interesting to watch because we had a super dominant, much like TI3, right? TI3 Alliance came out with this split pushing, like really obnoxious split push and timed pushes. What they came up with the idea that of being able to have certain peaks. When your hero reached a peak, when a certain strategy reached a peak, that's when Alliance would go for the push. They weren't necessarily all about the split pushing. Like, I think that gets repeated a little bit too much. What Alliance understood is being able to draw out the game or finish the game when their strategy was strongest to be able to end that. And if necessary, then they would have to go for the split push if that push failed, right? If they weren't able to end the game in time, then they would have to naturally draw into split push because the enemy team had better late game. So from a strategic element, Alliance came through and they just dominated. No one could really touch them, excluding Navi in a really clutch finals. Here, you have this really, really important meta, right? A really important strategy to the whole entire tournament where the death ball reigns supreme. And finally, somebody was able to counter it, and that was Zhao Wei. Like that was really his really big. If you point to any point in time in his career, that was his biggest strategic win, is being able to solve the death ball push and how to be able to defend and prolong the game until you can actually break the push.
So TI5, where he was with LGD, was the one that really kind of like won me over to Zhao Wei. Because when he won this one with Newbie, I mean, as he's saying, like they'd figured something out about the meta, like great. At the time, obviously, he had Hao, who, I mean, I've always been one of the, like an acolyte of that guy. I think he's a fantastic player now. But this LGD team that he had in 2015, you look at that team, and they didn't come in as a favourite for TI. They, there was plenty of other teams that actually underperformed that people thought might be better. And they came in, and they come 3rd place. And they, the star players, maybe it's this guy who actually famously, hasn't fulfilled on his potential yet. He'd been off in like that, like, sabbatical they gave him in CDEC or whatever,
Yeah.
So this team was a very different team than his success in the past. It's not like he just kept the same team and was changing one player in and out like PPD has. What did you think of the LGD team that he took to TI?
I thought going into the tournament, I remember I think I did my rankings on this team. And I was more optimistic about LGD than many other people.
Okay.
So I will have a little bit different perspective.
But where did you have them though?
Because of maybe, honestly,
Okay.
because it was Zhao 8, right? A TI winner combined with some very strong mechanical players. Like they had a lot of veterans on their team. They had MMY, who's like, old school legend. I thought maybe I would put his name in the hat. That he had, that was still when he was with Yao.
Yep.
That guy had, I think that guy had some issues, but I think ultimately he was good enough to be able to get LGD in third place. And then they also had maybe on their mid position. And I think like I was rather optimistic about that team. I know like there was a lot of people who were like backing Ice and his team with How, but I thought that LGD would actually be quite the strong team. So I didn't have necessarily the most pessimistic view, but I think that you're right. LGD was not necessarily a favored team, and they went in there. They did very well in the groups. They crushed it, and then they went from who did they get knocked down by? I think it was probably CDC or EG, right? Either way, it was one of those two teams, right? They got knocked down by the first or second place team. Either way, and then I remember because they had to play against Virtus Pro, and they just crushed that game. I think I casted that. They just destroyed it because they were from a strategy element. I remember they did two different things. They took the CDEC gyrocopter and played super aggressive with their one position and did what CDEC was doing throughout that tournament and established a very aggressive, like you always took the first step when it came to initiation. You never let the enemy initiate on you. You never played passive. You never let the counter initiation happen. They played one game like that, and then they played another game that was super slow, where they had they had better late game. They had heroes that were not necessarily super aggressive, that would go out at 15 minutes and make things happen. They had heroes that would sit in their lanes and farm so much more. And the fact that he was able to cobble two very opposing drafts at that point in time in the middle of this tournament and make them work in this series to be able to beat VP and just trash them, I think, both times says a lot about Zhao Wei, and also about the way the team trusted him, right? You just as easily could have fallen back and said, oh, we won the first game off of our really aggressive, gyrocopter, etc. Let's just do that again, right? And show VP, show the CIS Guardians, what's up when it comes to aggression. But instead, he chose to take the opposite approach and actually cobble their strategy together. I think that was quite contradictory to ultimately what people thought the meta was about. Right, he played a much slower game for that game too, and he made it work. Not just from a drafting perspective, but I think also that the team played to what his ideas were, because they just played a game where they were being super aggressive, and then they took that game too and were able to follow Zhao Wei's lead and not go into some of these team fights and let VP kind of run out of steam. And let them kind of wear themselves out when it came to these aggressive attempts at ganking and pushing down towers. They let them do all that and said, we're not going to fight you. We're not necessarily going to need to. And they took a later game approach. And I think that says a lot about Zhao Wei as a captain, that he was able to take these very divergent styles and fit them into one series in the middle of the biggest tournament of the year.
What is his kind of philosophy on how he uses himself within the compositions? Like what sort of thing he picks for himself? How he's going to define his role? Is there a set kind of? Do you know what to expect from him in a game?
I think he's always had some of his favorite heroes. Like when he was playing offlane, I remember thinking that he picked up Beastmaster a lot for himself. But I think like that, it was only one real small part. It just happened to be a hero that both fit the meta really well as fit his playstyle that he was quite good at. But I think that more than anything, I think his philosophy was that he just fits wherever the team kind of needs him. And that comes just not through a hero pick perspective, but also through a role, like his position in the team, right? When he played both offlane as well as mid when it was needed. He rotated over to the support position as you went later on to the years of Dota, and was still able to be a very prolific support off of that position. So I think I believe that his philosophy would be more of a I fit into what the teams needed rather than necessarily always forcing the team to adjust to him, especially on a core position. You know, if you're a core and a captain, to still be able to fit your pick into what the team needs rather than necessarily what you want to play or what you think you'll be dominant on, that says a lot about the maturity and how you view the teamwork aspect of Dota.
Okay, so who is our fourth and final name going to be?
So our fourth name is going to be... so I've made a really big deal when it comes to being a captain and being versatile and the strategy elements that come to Dota. And I wanted to pick up a player that was very mechanically sound, but I couldn't really force myself to go to a player that didn't also have some leadership elements to him. So my fourth pick is going to be probably the godfather of Southeast Asian Dota, Mushi, who is arguably, if you look at the three names that we've listed so far, Mushi from a mechanical look at the game when it comes to like his play within the game and how he was able to his quick reactions and his play in the mid lane and all that sort of things. Like, he was the most dominant player on our list. None of these other players, if you look at them, they don't necessarily shine. Like if they're like, if we want to have like any carry in the world, are we going to pick Fear? Maybe, just because of the versatility. Are we going to pick Puppy for if we need a forward position? Maybe, but not necessarily. There are plenty of forward positions, especially now, as the forward position has opened up for so many players like Jarex and Crit, who are so high impact in the first 15 minutes of the game. We're not necessarily going to pick up a Puppy in our dream team, nor are we going to pick up a Zhao 8 when it comes to the support or the offlane position. But Mushi even now remains a dominant in-game player. He's probably he's the only player on our list who can look back and say he was number one. People may disagree, but all the way going back into the Dota 1 days, he was a dominant mid, and he was probably the only non-Chinese player at a certain point in time who was looked at as one of the best mids in the world. You know, you looked at Weapon X, right? Weapon X, the mid player, who obviously goes by MMY. The Yafets, right? Look at all those old Chinese mid players and how dominant they were. And then you go back to Mushi. Mushi was in the running, right? Mushi was always like one of the few non-Chinese players who could win a potential 1v1 mid contest. You know, like that's how good this guy was. And he was also a captain. He was one of the veterans. He's one of the people who's, you know, cultivating his scene, his region, more than any other player. Like, no one can contest Mushi when it comes to that. Ice is the only other Southeast Asian player who's has that sort of history and notoriety to this day. But I don't think Ice has had nearly the impact as Mushi has, because Mushi was a stronger player earlier, and he's been that captain role.
So this is a player who played in one of my favorite teams, which is obviously Team DK, who's famed for being incredibly good and having all those crazy games, but obviously they didn't deliver with the TI. That was one of those famous ones where it's like the curse of Dota is almost everyone who's super good in like the spring, you can't keep it together, you know, until that international comes up. Maybe if the international took place in like May, some of these teams could win, but those 3 months while you're on top, it's almost like you train everyone else how to beat you. But when he was in Team DK, the reason why this is a fan favorite team that so many people love is because they not only were winning, but they were almost the sort of team that like an idiot fan might put together. Like, I might just put like, oh, imagine if this player played with this player, and then like, yeah, but and then it did work, and they actually were winning. What was his role like in Team DK?
I mean, Mushi showed himself that he could actually be a 1v1 god. You know, like he was back in the day. He was really good in those 1v1 positions. Even going into, what was it? I think it was DAC. They had a 1v1 competition. Like, I think he made the finals of that. I don't know if he won it or not, but like, that guy proved that mid is probably the most mechanically intricate role, right? We've had patches that have gone back and forth, the importance of the 1v1 aspect of mid has come and gone. Like, we used to have times where it was Queen of Pain and Puck matchups, and we got to watch this really mechanically intricate matchup happen where the individual players would try and pull creeps to themselves and get harassment, still get CS, and still dodging these abilities and these moments of aggression and how they would be able to respond. They did all of that, and that 1v1 was extremely interesting on watch. But even then, we got outside of that, right? And we got to mids that were being frequently, if not all the time, being ganked up by supports in the mid position, and that 1v1 element became a little bit lessened. But Mushi was always a strong mid. He won 1v1s. He could do that 1v1 aspect of the mid position, but he could also play, for example, now we have the mid position is more of a carry role. Now, it is oftentimes filled by your one position, despite the safe lane being the lane that oftentimes gets the guaranteed farm and all that sort of thing. We're seeing more and more mids being picked up that are going to be the hero that scales the best later into the game. And Mushi's able to do that very well. He's able to play the Invoker. He's able to play the Tinker. Like that Tinker, I think, is a great example of a hero that not necessarily always gets to have the best time in the mid lane, because he's going to be a target for the enemy supports to gank and shut down and keep him from being able to get those boots of travels. But he will be the one who carries you in the game later on at 35 minutes, at 45 minutes. He'll be able to do that. I think Mushi has proved himself to be versatile in a different aspect of Dota. He's not necessarily he played support and all that sort of thing, but he isn't someone who's had to bounce around from a whole bunch of roles. He's proved within this one role to be able to adjust to the changing tides of the meta and how Dota 2 has changed over the years.
Okay, so since you were mentioning a lot of the names before and about how, they kept it up for many, many years, and, they were always remaining near the top, or they could come back and they could adapt to the later eras, there was a time where it looked like someone like Mushi wouldn't be on a list like this anymore. If you look last year, basically after DK, they bombed it at that TI, and he went back to Southeast Asia, and he was playing there, and he was with the team that basically is Fnatic, the same core was Team Malaysia, Titan, etc. This team was one where I remember, they had some fan favoritism behind them, but purely because they were always the underdog. People wanted to believe they'd win that quarterfinal match, but they weren't going to, they were going to just break your heart there, and they weren't going to make top 4. But somehow things changed. The year went on. He stuck with the same core, and now they are a team that somehow is making real headway in Dota. So what do you think of this reinvention in terms of playing just for a Southeast Asian team, not having to be that guy who, the whole thing was before, it was that thing of Ice, sure, these guys aren't from China, but they're so good, even the Chinese teams want them, That was kind of what you thought the path to success was for these guys before.
I think that whole period of time, right, where he went to Team Malaysia, and I thought I was going to see this legend that I had watched for so long just slowly spiral down the drain. That's actually what I thought when I was watching this team. I thought that Mushi would start scaling out of relevance. And he just I don't know what he did, just through sheer willpower or whatever. He was like, no, I'm going to make Fnatic work. And he's made it work, even though the region has, once upon a time, Southeast Asia was the most, one of the most dominant regions, way back. And then we got to this this era of TI3, TI4, where Southeast Asia became viewed as a incredibly weak region that could only really offer one or two teams at best, usually one team that would be able to really be competitive on the international stage. And Fnatic, was kind of always the go-to, right? It was always that Mushi team. If it wasn't the Mushi team, there was the Ice team. And those were the team that was always sort of representing Southeast Asia, and you got to see, okay, well, they're from C. Are they actually going to be able to keep up with, the Chinese? Or are they going to be able to keep up with, Team Secret or whatever? Would they be able to do that? And I think that they grinded through that period of time, and they proved themselves to be an international competitor, and now they stay incredibly relevant today. While Southeast Asia, I think, is arguably in the best position it's been since Dota 1 or maybe TI2. You know, I think that they're all of a sudden in a position where, or excuse me, TI3, where they're in a position where like Southeast Asia is getting crazy good. And they're getting super competitive, and they're playing within their own region, and they're getting so much better, and yet they still remain that go-to team to beat. And that says so much, right? The whole entire region has scaled so much better in the last year and a half. And Fnatic still remains sort of like the Godfathers. They've had their trip-ups, yes, and you kind of wonder where the current squad is going to go. But I think because of the way that I saw Team Malaysia, and maybe the way I expected him to just go by the wayside, that I was just going to say goodbye to one of my idols, like I said goodbye to HYHY, you know, and I was going to be like, all right, I loved watching you, dude, but, you know, there you go. You know, I loved watching Ohio, but, you know, there he goes. The Mushi, he grinded that back in some ways, and he said, I will not go out. I'm going to remain one of the best players out there. And somehow, when it comes, we're like at the highest mechanically skilled players that has ever been seen in Dota. And this guy still remains a relevant mid. He may not be the best mid, you know, but he still remains in a top 8 team. He still remains as a top 8 mid position. And I think that is something that is extremely respectable. That despite all the newcomers that keep coming and going, Mushi remains. You know, he remains the godfather of Southeast Asia, where all these young and up-and-coming players have to like get his blessing before they go out and play out in the international stage. They have to be able to play with or against Mushi at some point in time and be able to get his blessing before they can actually go out and compete against the best of the best. You know, and I think that that Mushi, in some ways, he represents the old guard of Dota for his region. He represents the guy who's grinded through and persevered through all the shitty moments. He was there when Dota was, you know, just wasn't really something that you could live off of. He grinded through a period of time where Southeast Asia just didn't really have many teams to be able to offer up, that many of the old veterans had to go off and do military service or actually get a real job because Dota couldn't actually keep up. Dota couldn't really support them. So there just wasn't that many tier 2 or tier 3 teams that were respectable enough to really be able to challenge. And Mushi grinded through all of that and is now it remains a strong player in probably the hardest era ever of Dota 2 to be a good competitive professional player.
So was this international like a fairy tale for you then? I mean, if I'd have told you before the tournament starts, by the way, like Mushi and Fnatic finish above OG, Team Liquid, Newbie, I mean, you'd take that, right? That's pretty good.
I certainly would. I mean, when I saw TI, there was this game, and I can't remember what it was, but I was like, oh god, I was like, Fnatic's done for. I think it was they faced up against one of the favorites. It was either OG or Team Liquid.
I mean, in the lower bracket they played Liquid. Was it them?
Yeah. Okay. So it would have been Team Liquid, and that's right. I casted that game too. So. And I remember thinking, oh god, I was like, all right, Fnatic, you know, you have to face up against Team Liquid, who was one of the favorites of the tournaments. Even if they didn't do well in the group stage, you kind of expected Team Liquid to bounce back, just because Kuro had managed to do it so many times before. So I was like, all right, Fnatic, you're facing up against Team Liquid in a best of 3. Didn't really think that was going to go well, and they just destroyed. They picked up I don't know, they did. I'm trying to remember what that game was like, because I remember at least one of those games they did a very heavy. Fnatic at that point was very team fight heavy and push oriented. So I thought Liquid, who naturally were one of the better teams when it came to understanding team fights and how to be able to set them up, would be able to trounce Fnatic. But they just were able to, within the game, outplay Liquid so many different ways that it proved that, oh, like, it just gave me that, like, that jolt of, like, holy shit, you know, like, Fnatic's still in it. And then they went on, and after they beat Liquid, I was like, holy cow, I wonder how far these guys can go. And then they ended up having to face up against MVP Phoenix again, who MVP Phoenix were continually matched up against Fnatic in all these Southeast Asian qualifiers, and Fnatic remained, at least online, the team that would always do better. And then Fnatic would always do much worse when it came to LANs, while MVP Phoenix were the team that would pull it in with the clutch, you know? Like, they would always, at LAN, outperform. And, you know, I've talked to those guys, and they said that there were certain reasons for it. But Fnatic, they demolished Liquid, they demolished through MVP Phoenix, and then they ended up going out against the second place team. You know, that's pretty respectable. I think that Digital Chaos really hit their stride at that tournament. But Fnatic, I think through just sheer force of will or something, remained and got that top 4, despite me thinking that they were going to get bottom 8.
Okay, so of your 4 names, you've already kind of outlined, you know, what your philosophy was as to why you picked them, but who was the most questionable? Who was the most touch and go that took the most thought?
All of them were pretty easy, honestly. I guess the only one that was a little bit touch and go is whether or not I was going to go Zhao 8 or a different Chinese player, or whether I was going to go Mushi or Ice Ice Ice. I think I think other people might say Ice 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 just because I think in some ways he has such a large fan base and he's such a mechanically gifted player. I think Ice 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 is... I just went through a replay of Ice recently, and I watched a game from the enemy team's perspective, right? So I'm going through this replay at high speed, and I'm watching the game as if I only have the vision of the enemy team. And I had my mouse clicked on Ice Ice Ice, and I watched the way that he moved around the map, and I swear to God, it was like Houdini. You know, like this guy would just pop out constantly and be able to make plays happen. And that's what Ice 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 has always done. You know, he's always been able to make the impossible happen. He's been able to get the first blood against a tri-lane because he just makes this really clutch play by his tower or something like that. He's the guy who is able to dominate a match from 50 minutes forward because he's able to just read the right rotations of what the enemy team is doing and stay off the map and catch them off guard constantly. I think that's really the closest contest. Is that I think Ice Ice Ice, you could very easily argue that he is the better player over Mushi within his role. That I think he's probably higher up when it comes to where other pro players would rate him for his role. I think many different teams would love to have Ice 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 as their offlaner. And then I think there are plenty other mids who would take place over Mushi, and there are plenty other supports who would take place over Mushi. But that was really the closest contest, I think, simply because Ice Ice Ice, I think, is a better individual player right now. But Mushi has the whole entire captain thing going for him, so...